Welcome to SEVA VentRounds. Today is May 27, 2025, and the topic for today is opening pressure, and we're going to talk a little bit about waveform anatomy. The disclosure is there is no endorsement of any mode, ventilator, or manufacturer. Whatever we say, it's our opinion. It does not represent the Cleveland Clinic's. My conflicts of interest and disclosures are here, as well as Rob's, for all of you to be aware. In terms of ground rules, please keep your microphone muted, and we may call upon members of the audience to comment, or you can use the chat function. We're monitoring the chat function actively, and evidently, if you want to unmute yourself and talk, that's also very welcome. The key here is that you don't leave it unblocked or unmuted, and we capture things that we don't because these are recorded sessions. There are CRCEs for those respiratory therapists attending, and fill your evaluation, and there's going to be a QR code to get you there at the end of this chat. So the key SEVA knowledge that we need to recognize for this session is how volume control square waveform represents the loads of the respiratory system. And we have used this geometric kind of presentation in which you have the elastic load and the resistive load, and the addition of these two together gives you the pressure on the ventilator. This is obviously a passive patient. And so you can see here the flow on the bottom, and the flow is constant throughout. And as the flow is delivered through time, the volume will increase linearly because the flow is constant. And so when we add flow plus the elastic load plus the resistive load, it will give us the P vent. And you can see that the first step up on the pressure waveform is due to the resistive load, and here in this shaded green area. And then the elastic load will start to increase as the volume is delivered to the alveoli, such that at the end of the breath, there is going to be elastic and resistive, waveform. Elastic and resistive are going to be together. So this difference over here, actually, if you notice, it's exactly the difference over here because it's the whole resistive load. So if we do a plateau pause or a pause at the end of an inspiratory hold, and you eliminate all the flow by doing that hold, then the load that you have left is the elastic load. And so the difference between peak and plateau and the initial step up should be the same. Rob, any comments there?
Nope, it's just very good to be able to recognize these components as ideal waveforms, so then you can understand what happens when they deviate from that.
That's an absolute truth. Is you have to really understand and memorize how these waveforms look, because then every difference you will understand why they are happening. So thank you, Rob. So here's your first waveform for you to recognize, and let's start by the tag. So what is the tag for this mode? And remember, type it in your chat. What do you believe that the tag is? If you don't have this type of ventilator, this is a Hamilton C6. So if you use the vent mode app, that will help you find the tag. Or if you're a frequent user or you want to read the waveform, you can also identify what's the tag. And I wait for a little bit while people type. There you go. Thank you, Fernando. So Fernando jumps into the group that recognizes this as being volume control, CMV, S. And so just to dissect a little bit, and there's some things that we teach on this when we talk about volume control, that because of the way that this ventilator has the sensor may not look identical to the way that an ideal waveform would look. And the reason is because the flow waveform depicted here is what's being captured at the Y of the ventilator circuit. So it will demonstrate some aberrancies that will not look identical to a very nice, and I'm going to paint over this one, but a square waveform. And those differences are because there's the circuit compliance that changes, and it will cause these aberrancies on how the flow looks. But if you did it something as simple as, for example, crimp a little bit the ET tube, or put pressure over the chest of the patient, you would see that the flow does not change. And that's one of the ways that we can see that this is volume control, when the flow doesn't change, when there's changes in resistance, compliance, or PMOS. Rob, any disagreement there?
No, just to add though, if you did crimp someone's endotracheal tube with your finger for a second, you would see no change in flow, but you'd see the pressure rise. So the distortion in the pressure and no distortion in the flow is the dead giveaway that that's volume control.
Excellent. This is followed by the breath sequence. And the breath sequence, just to remind everybody, Fernando told us this is continuous mandatory ventilation, and that's because all breaths are mandatory. And this ventilator will put a little triangle whenever, and it would put it on the color of what the variable that is triggering. And you will see, and I'm going to paint it here just so that you will see how it would look, but it looks like a triangle like that, and that tells you that it's a patient triggered breath. And at least that doesn't mean that there was PMOS, but the ventilator is identifying this as a patient effort. And just the fact that we don't see that in any of the breaths that we have here immediately tells you that these are mandatory. All are mandatory. The second is because these are volume controlled breaths, and all volume controlled breaths are mandatory. They cannot be spontaneous. And finally, in this type of ventilator, we know that this is set point because we set the tidal volume, the inspiratory time, and the flow that it gets to be delivered. So this is, as set point means that you set everything. You are the one that controls the ventilator and what's going to be delivered. Rob?
Yeah, it's sometimes difficult to actually identify the targeting scheme just from a few breaths, because some of the targeting schemes interact with PMUS, right? So you just have to know it from looking at the ventilator mode map application or reading the operator's manual.
Exactly. And so, and you can get to that level. I mean, it's really important to recognize what the ventilator is doing. That's how we get a lot of interactions that we say, "Ooh, this ventilator is doing something that we didn't expect." So it's like retroactive engineering to figure out what the ventilator is doing from the waveforms that we see from patient interactions. So now the question for the team is, what is the load? Is it elastic or resistive? All right, let's start seeing some. Yeah. And so I see a fair amount of resistive loads coming through. And so during inspiration, there are some features that tell us that there's resistive, and also during exhalation. So I'm going to start just for the sake of it from exhalation, and then we'll spend some time during inspiration, just because of the way the teaching point that will appear soon. But you can see that the flow doesn't get to baseline, and perhaps it's because of the speed of the rate that this patient has. But you can see that this is a second, and the flow was not even close to getting to baseline. You can see that it keeps going and going and going for a while. So definitely this is resistive load during exhalation. And then during inspiration, you immediately recognize, or just remember that when there's an initial increase on flow, because the flow is square, the initial step up is a resistive load. So you see and in this ventilator, it doesn't look as sharp as in the other waveform, but it doesn't really matter. The initial step up that you see over here is the resistive load. And that is increased. It's certainly pretty high. And then you can see the slope looks relatively flat. But then you have a pause. And that pause shows a difference that looks visually strikingly smaller than the other one, right? In usual terms, you'll hear us talk in SEVA VentRounds that the resistance during inspiration and during expiration, they're aligned. They usually follow. But I would also say that normally what you see is that the resistance at the beginning of the breath and at the end of the breath are mostly very similar. And instead of that, we're seeing a very high step up here and a smaller step up down here. Rob?
Yeah, this relates to what you said at the very beginning. In the ideal waveform, you have a rectangle on top of a triangle. Here you have basically a parallelogram on top of, your triangle for resistance. So that doesn't have parallel sides.
It
So that tells
doesn't.
you something's wrong, right?
Right. So this is the worst drawing that I have done in 75 years. Okay, let me erase that. Sorry. It will be better the second time. I'll try. All right. So just for the sake of viewership, so there's a line that goes like this here, and then this one goes down like that in a way. So you can see that the base of this parallelogram is bigger than the top of it. And that means that the resistance was higher at the beginning of the breath. So this is a patient that is passive. So in this case, there is no patient ventilator discordance. There is no PMOS at all. So I'm just gonna eliminate that discussion here. And the question that you get is, why is that resistance higher at the beginning than at the end? Yeah, Leora, that's so good question, Leora. So Leora is saying, well, couldn't the elastic load also be elevated because the plateau seems to be a little bit high? And I didn't put here the cursor, but if you try to extrapolate from where we are, I think that the plateau that given P was 25. But let's do the exercise. So let's do the exercise here. So the plateau is 25, and the PEEP in this was set at 5. All right. So the driving pressure for this patient, according to this measurement, is well, actually, right now Rob is going to slap me 3 times because he's going to say that's not the driving pressure, Eduardo. The driving pressure is that the driving pressure is. Anybody wants to write it in the chat? So we know one is the P plat minus the. Come on. There you go. Excellent, Lee. Minus the total PEEP. So PEEP tot. This is key for us to recognize, because if I had done this calculation, I would have said the driving pressure is 20. But if I had done an end expiratory pause, this patient actually had some auto PEEP. So let's say that it was at 7. So this patient had the true driving pressure would then be 18 because it's 25 minus 7. Does that make sense? Excellent. So your this conversation is taking you to 2 key points. The first one is when you talk about driving pressure, you need, especially when there's an increased resistive load, you need to do the PEEP tot, and that's a common error in a lot of articles out there and manuscripts that we calculate without doing an end expiratory pause. We just use the set PEEP. Rob?
The reason why you see that a lot in the literature is because they do retrospective analysis on data from the electronic health record, and oftentimes therapists don't do the total PEEP maneuver. They don't record that anywhere. So the next best thing is to use a set PEEP. But that does, as you say, introduce noise and error into the calculations.
Excellent. So the second question that I have for the group is, all right, Leora introduced the concept that this patient may have an increased elastic load based on the driving pressure and the plateau pressure. But the question for you all is, why is the resistance at the beginning higher than at the end? Any thoughts there? Yeah, so the comments start coming is they're talking about, well, is it to overcome auto PEEP, or is it a decrease in dynamic airway collapse, recruitment of small airways? So we're close to the concept. So you recognize the increased resistive load, and that probably is where part of the concept lies, but it's not exclusive for increased resistance. This also happens on other conditions. So let me show you what we, this is a graph. I mean, I'm really like this graph because it tells you the story. And then I show you how did we know this. But I want you to notice that we increased the PEEP from 5 to 14, okay? And this is after we had done a series of other stuff. So we were analyzing this patient. But I want you to realize how the step up that we had, right, went down. So from here to here, and now you can see this one, and the step up has become the same size for both breadths. You see that? How the parallelogram resolved from being this big chunk of distance that occurred over here to now being the same height. And so any comments of why that happened? Yeah, there you go. So Fernando put it, so it's need more pressure to overcome the airway opening pressure. So this is a graph that or a pattern that you need to recognize. When you see a discrepant inspiratory step up in a patient on a square waveform, and there's the step up versus the difference between plateau and peak. When there's a major discrepancy, that is a hint that this patient has an airway opening pressure. And that means that the airways are collapsed, or that and so you need to increase the pressure until you pop them open, and then the volume can go in. And so this has several implications. This has several implications, and the one of them I will just highlight immediately is if you look at the delta, the driving pressure, has become much smaller. So now the plateau continues to be at the same level, which is 25 or 26, whatever. And the delta between 40 and 25, or the auto PEEP, which I believe it was at 16 for this patient. So now this patient has 11 of driving pressure. So airway opening pressure will cause false elevations or overestimation of your driving pressure by the nature of it. Rob?
I think 25 minus 16 is 9, isn't it? Not 11.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. That's why I didn't go to primary school.
There is another minor point that I don't want to confuse what you just said, because that was an excellent explanation. But in the chat, I noticed Karsten said that some of that initial rise in pressure could be due to the overcoming the auto PEEP. So if there was no airway opening pressure problem here, because there was no auto, and there was auto PEEP, then the fact is that the airway pressure has to rise to the level of auto PEEP before you get any positive flow. So there is a little rise in pressure that's equal to the auto PEEP initially, just to get flow to go to zero. So yes, Carson is right, but it just I don't want to confuse the issue here.
Perfect. And I want to show you, this is one of the maneuvers that we did initially. I mean, this patient had severe hypoxia, and we were trying to figure out what was going on. So we did a PV tool on this patient, and just for those that have not seen a PV tool done before, essentially you inject air into the lung. The ventilator just provides very low flow, slowly, so that there's no resistive load, and then measures the volume on the y-axis and the pressure on the x-axis. So here's pressure, you can see pressure, and you can see volume. And the initial thing that you would see is that as the pressure is increasing, there is no volume being delivered, or at least on this range of the scale, you cannot see any. There is certainly some volume being delivered, but it's this, we cannot see it at this scale of the graph that we have here. But then suddenly, pop! Where this is, there is the red dot. Not sorry, the red dot, the black dot. You can see suddenly the volume starts increasing, as long as the pressure. And so the dot that you have here is cursor number 1 over here, and you can see that the airway pressure was 14. That was the airway pressure at which the airways opened. And so we knew that ahead of time. I mean, when we had done the PV curve, I wish I could say that we had recognized the airway opening by the graph before, but actually it was in retrospect. We were assessing the patient, and we saw, we were trying to figure out what was going on, and until we didn't put the patient on a square waveform did this become evident. But it was after we had seen the presence of an airway opening on the PV curve that we did here. Rob?
It might be confusing to some people that you said a little bit of volume is being introduced, but you can't see it on that scale. Where is it being introduced? Well, into the compliance of the patient circuit. And this
Correct.
paper that I just put in the chat explains all that.
Thank you, Roberto. Thank you. So there you go. The teaching points, there are several teaching points for us to recognize here. The first one is when you have the discrepancy between the initial step up and the peak inspiratory pressure minus the plateau, P plat. If these are different, these two values, you should suspect that something is happening and that may be airway opening. And this statement that I'm putting here, this statement is only valid when you're on volume control, CMVS, with a square waveform. Because if you have other types of waveforms, this may be completely different. But it's a diagnostic maneuver that you can do, and it has been described on the literature. And the author's name is escaping, Handeberg, and I'm destroying her the last name, but very nice article describing this maneuver that you just saw as a diagnostic mechanism, especially when you don't have a BP volume pressure loop. And so the take-home message here is regarding the driving pressure. And so remember that your driving pressure in the presence of airway opening pressure or auto PEEP can be can lead to inappropriate measurements. So remember, always use the total, the PEEP total, always use the PEEP total, and always look for airway opening pressure, especially on patients with severe asthma, with severe obesity. Those are patients that may have an airway opening pressure. Rob, any other words of wisdom?
Well, I just noticed that a lot of people like to use a descending ramp waveform in volume control. This would be an argument against doing that, or at least doing it all the time without even considering taking a look at what happens in the square wave.
Yeah, I love that, because I would argue that the only reason to use volume control under these circumstances, the patient is deeply sedated or paralyzed, and there's no patient-ventilator interaction. And so then you probably want the waveform that will provide the most amount of information per management. So I really like that, Rob.
Thank you.
For those that are CCF, there's the CME. For those that are RTs, there's your CRCE for credits and our codes. We will invite you again to send us your images on Twitter or to our email. There's prior episodes of VentRounds, and as well as if you want to subscribe to the to register for our SEVA VentRounds that it's happening in September, please do. We would love to have you come over to Cleveland and do the full SEVA courses, and it's open and it's filling up quickly. Believe it or not, we are almost there. So please do register. So thank you very much, Rob. Any last words of wisdom, my friend?
No, just thank you to the participants who showed up today. They had some really excellent answers, and hope to see you again.
All right. Keep it up. Have a great day.